Hey guys, we have a real treat for you today in our conversation with Rahkim Sabree, author of Overcoming Financial Trauma, a great book. Can't recommend highly enough. And we had a great conversation. It was a lengthy conversation, but it had a lot of value packed into it. So typically when we have interviews, we try to keep them to 40 minutes or less or so. But Rakim and I, we share a lot of common values. He has a lot of wisdom to share. So we just pressed record until we had nothing left to say. So because of that, we took an abbreviated version, which is still a little longer than our interview podcast, but I think you will appreciate it. And we're releasing that abbreviated version on today's podcast on the full public forum. But as you know, we also have a private podcast feed for members of our email community that you can access or join by going to newmoneynewproblems.com/subscribe. And in the intro email, you'll get a link to that private podcast. So if you hear this and you're interested in the full version, which is about 25-30 minutes longer than what you'll see on the public feed, you can access that private podcast feed and hear the full and unedited version on that platform. All right, let's get into it.
Let's get some money.
From New Money, New Problems, it's the New Money, New Problems podcast, a show for successful professionals searching for the tools they need to navigate financial opportunities and obstacles they've never seen. Negotiating compensation, purchasing your first investment property, helping your family with money, the highs and lows of entrepreneurship. New Money brings new problems that require new solutions. Join us as we work through them together. I'm Brenton Harrison, and this is the New Money, New Problems podcast.
Hello and welcome to the New Money, New Problems podcast. We have a very special episode in store for you today. And as is the case when I bring on a financial expert, I try to give some context or some pretext to how they got to the show. We have a guest today that, very interestingly enough, this is the first time that I've actually spoken to him, but I feel like we have been circling each other's orbits for like years. And it's funny in the financial space, in the Black content space, there's a ton of people out there putting out content. There's a ton of people out there putting financial content. But when you hear something special, it jumps out at you. And I can say for sure that over the course of the last few years, as I've paid more attention to this man's content, it jumps out at you. He is an author. He is a financial therapist. He's a great many things, but I'm going to let him give the full introduction of who he is on the New Money, New Problems podcast.
Awesome. So thank you for having me first off. My name is Rahkim Sabree. I'm a financial therapist, author, speaker. I really advocate for promoting the awareness rather around financial trauma and its impact. So a lot of my work over the last 5 years or so has been geared towards not only socializing what is financial trauma, but contributing to the space so that it's a little bit more broad and not just viewed through the lens of an individual's personal failings, right? But through the lens of society's failure. And so I'll leave it there. As we get into the conversation, I think we'll have a lot of opportunity to kind of dissect that, but happy to be here.
For sure. Well, we won't wait too long I'll try to bring it back here. We won't wait too long to at least make sure you see the book. So we're going to do some giveaways of his most recent book, Overcoming Financial Trauma. But we will definitely share more about that as we talk today. Let's start with kind of your origin story. You know, I'm a superhero fan, big Superman fan, big Batman fan. So I try to ask people like, what's your origin story? Tell us a little bit about your journey from the beginning to here.
Yeah. So I think I spent a lot of time talking over the course of my career, right? I've spent a lot of time talking about the painful experiences with money in my upbringing. I became conscious of the household finances after my parents separated. And so we lived in an apartment in Mount Vernon, New York. And my mom like leaning on me as the oldest child to be the, so-called man of the house after my dad and her separated. And in that experience, I became aware of the food stamps that we had, Section 8 that we had. I'd helped to budget those food stamps. I'd helped to make administrative decisions within the household, and up to and including a lot of the chores, right, like cooking and cleaning and those kind of things. It's really stepping up. And there's a moment that I talk about in the book where I come home from school and I see an eviction notice on the door. And I'm coming in and like I'm dealing with the embarrassment because we're in the first floor, and so in order to get to any other apartment on that side of the building, you have to walk past our door. And this flood of emotions and thoughts come into mind when I see this eviction notice, around who saw it, what are they thinking, whose fault is it, all of the questions. And I think I was probably 14, 15 when this happened. So I snatched the notice off the door, I go inside, tell my mom, and I'm like, are we gonna need to find a place to stay? And I focus on that moment because so much after that moment I can trace back to seeing the eviction notice on the door. In the book I describe it as this feeling of powerlessness, not necessarily of being poor, but of not having power to do something. And in my practice, when I work with people and I ask them, what does money represent to you? One of the top 3 answers that I get is power, right? And so, just fast forward a little bit, we're talking about a 14, 15-year-old Rakim. By the time I turned 26, I had purchased a property, purchased a home of my own, multifamily. I was very proud. I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and, this is the way, as it was articulated. And I didn't realize how much of my response to that moment, I'll describe it as a financial trauma, or as a trauma response, was wrapped up in the accomplishment and really the drive to go out and own property, right? To prevent any individual from telling me through an eviction notice, right? Like, you have to find someplace else to live. And so I'll pause there because I know that's generally a heavy kind of anecdote to share. But that is really the origin story, right? That is the foundation of so much of my drive and my passion related to understanding money. How do I use money? How do I acquire assets? And I don't have the vocabulary for these things at 14 and 15, but certainly that was something that was tucked away. And when we look at people in their money stories, what I see often, I'm sure you see this as well, is that so much of that story is formulated in childhood, right? It's formulated by the early experiences that we have with money. We hold on to that, even if we are no longer in a place where we are threatened or we feel unsafe. Our brain may not recognize that safety. And so we may be operating from a on paper level place of success, but still kind of chasing the safety that we at one point in time did not feel like we had.
Absolutely. I've read the book in full, it's excellent, which is part of why we're giving it away. We've had some other authors on, and we try to make sure we support. I know that through reading your work and hearing you speak, that you believe very strongly in some of the impacts of the things that we observe on money at an early age. I know that you reference in your work the work of Brad Klontz. In actuality, he was the very first guest we ever had on this podcast. I would say from reading your work, you take it a step further in having your own definition of financial trauma, and the way you focus on how the same event can impact 2 different people differently. So can you share your definition of financial trauma?
Yeah, so financial trauma is any instance observed or experienced that has a negative impact on the way someone views, interacts with, or believes about money.
So it's important to say that that's not like that's your definition, right?
That is the Rakim original, yeah.
I'm just making sure you credit yourself where it's due. So I bring that up because you talk about the eviction notice, and in your book and in some of your talks, you also reference the fact that while all this was going on, you have siblings, but your siblings were experiencing a very different reality. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think, it's funny, when I was writing the book, I was thinking of a particular person, right? And as I think most authors do, right? There's an avatar, and that avatar was somebody who is first generation, high income earner. Maybe they are a first generation college graduate. And a lot of times in the writing of this book, I was envisioning a man or a male figure because that is the experience that I can relate to, right? After the book was written, and I started to kind of analyze and pull back the layers of who am I going to market this book to, I realized that the more captive audience would be a population of women. And so as I've been kind of doing research around, what are the things that women are engaging with on social media, what are the topics that matter to them, one of the things that struck out to me very strongly is the oldest daughter, or this conversation around the oldest daughter, and how in many instances she is responsible essentially for being like a second mom. And I thought that was a really interesting phenomenon, because although I'm the oldest son, a lot of parallels can be drawn between what my experience was in stepping up to fill, the role of man of the house when it came to my younger siblings. Interesting piece of nuance here to share is my immediate younger brother is, I think he's 16 months younger than I am. So we're like, couldn't be closer, almost twins, right? And so there was a dynamic present of, my brother kind of looking at me like, who are you to like tell me what to do or to guide me, to direct me? You're just a couple months older than I am. And he was very rebellious in that time period, whereas I was very much kind of walking the line. Like, hey, let's not add on to the burden that mom is dealing with. Let's not add on to the stress that she's dealing with. And I was very sensitive to that during that time period. But answering your question, my brother had, in his rebellion, and for whatever other reasons existed, decided that he wanted to live primarily or spend most of his time with my father. And because I had internalized the breakup between my parents as an attack on my mother, I had chosen a very strongly opposite stance. And so this created kind of a little bit of tension. And when I say a little bit, I'm being facetious. It created a lot of tension between my dad and I, but also created tension between my brother and I. And so what was my brother's reality when it came to money, when it came to the household finances, when it came to how I was internalizing the struggle financially, was not the same, because his experience at my dad's house was a little bit more positive. And this is not to say that my dad was rich or wealthy in any way, substantially greater than was the case with my mom, but there was just a day and night experience there. And for many years, up until really me sitting down to write this book, I had believed or kind of adopted this idea that we were all in the house together, that I was cooking and cleaning and taking care of my brother and my sister in the way that was expected of me and trying to be a good son, and that they were all feeling the pain or observing the pain financially in the same way that I was, until we sat down and had a conversation. Certainly I didn't want to write down some half-truths or anything that was not real. And so I went and I talked to my brother and I talked to my dad as I was writing the book, and I'm like, hey, let's talk about this. Like, can we clear this up? Can we get on the same page? And my brother's like, bro, like, I know that that's what was going on, but that wasn't my experience. And then even talking to my dad, where, significant healing has taken place in the relationship that he and I have, for us to be able to look at a painful experience in everybody's life, right? His life, my mom's life, my life, and to be real with each other as men and say, okay, like, let's talk about it. Like, what happened? My dad said something that was really striking to me. He goes, everything that you went through in that moment was, a choice, right? Like, you chose to stay with your mom. You didn't have to go through that. You didn't have to experience that. You could have come with me. And I was like, oof. I had to like eat that for a minute, because I was like, first of all, this is years ago, right? more than 15 years ago, over, maybe close to 20 years ago. And I'm like, I've been holding on to a lot of this pain related to my experience, related to money, allowing these experiences to define my approach to money and how I go after things. And you're telling me that what it is that I went through was a choice? But my dad in his older age has a lot of wisdom, and I think he kind of picked up on that, and he immediately followed up the statement with, maybe you had to go through what it is that you had to go through so that you can do the work that you're doing to prevent other people from going through what you went through, or so that you could give context to other people who don't have a choice. And I'm like, nice cleanup, Dad, right? Nice cleanup, Dad. But
let me rub those shoulders a bit to take the sting out of the words.
But I do believe that. I believe in that the servitude component, and when it comes to the way that I deliver the content that I deliver, and you talked about my belief in the observational aspects of these experiences. And you didn't say this, but I'm going to say this, just as significant as directly experiencing some of these experiences, right? Because what I try to break down in the book, and I think I've done a pretty good job, you can tell me if I didn't, is the understanding of the brain and how the brain processes things. And in that, the idea that the real or imagined threat they're the same, right? Our brain's going to respond to it in the same way. And so what may be not a big deal to you or to me or to somebody else may be like the end of the world for somebody. And I think when we look at money and these experiences around money just from a place of numbers, like there is no room for us to account for the way that something may impact somebody psychologically, emotionally, behaviorally. And so that's why these conversations matter.
For sure. Well, we're dancing around some of the topics that are in the book. So let's do this. Let's take a quick break. If you are listening to this and you are already intrigued, listen through the commercial break. Don't fast forward, because we're going to give you information on how you can enter into the drawing for the book and get access to some additional resources that Rakim has put aside for us. So listen to the commercial. We'll be right back after this.
As a part of today's episode, we're giving away 3 copies of Rakim's groundbreaking new book, Overcoming Financial Trauma. If you'd like to enter a drawing for your copy, go to newmoneynewproblems.com/Rakim. That's RAHKIM to throw your name in the hat. And if you're interested in Rakim's work and additional resources, check out the show notes or head to RakimSabree.com.
All right, we are back with Rahkim Sabree, author of Overcoming Financial Trauma. If you're looking on screen, we have the book right here. We're going to be doing a giveaway, of course, for that book. I want to talk about some of the things that you mentioned in the book, and I'm going to bring out some quotes a little later on that I have found that I want you to tell us more about. But before we even get into the quotes, there's a theory, not even a theory, there's a science that you mentioned in the book called epigenetics. And if you could talk about epigenetics and how it ties into the financial trauma that you discuss in your work.
Yeah, so epigenetics is the study of gene expression. And in relation to trauma specifically, it's a newer emerging field where we're looking at kind of how traumatic experiences and stress can trigger an expression of, your expression of genes across generations. So previously, epigenetics probably just looked like from a microbiology perspective, what does the environmental factors like food, maybe alcohol, maybe smoking cigarettes, maybe just kind of the quality of water that you drink, influence gene expression. Through a mental health and or trauma lens, we look at how, and I'm saying we, like I'm one of the researchers, but it was studied particularly within the population of Holocaust survivors, how individuals who had gone through the Holocaust and the trauma associated, deeply traumatizing experience, started to show in future generations the effects as if the future generations had experienced the trauma directly. And so there's 2 researchers that I mentioned in the book, Vivian Rakoff, who is the, my brain is jumping right now. There's Vivian Rakoff, and then there was Rachel Yehuda. Vivian Rakoff talked about the intergenerational transfer of trauma, not through an epigenetic lens, but in observations of Holocaust survivors. I believe he remarks that individuals, the children of Holocaust survivors, were demonstrating symptoms of psychosis, and I could be misquoting, but kind of paraphrasing him, as if they had experienced the trauma themselves. Rachel Yehuda, who is largely credited for kind of the rise in epigenetic studies and as it relates to trauma, went back and looked at Rakoff's work and did more experimentation and determined that there was actually, on a genetic level, a change in protein that the body produces as it relates to trauma. And so I took this concept of trauma transfer, particularly through an epigenetic lens, from a very broad spectrum, and applied it to the experiences that individuals have with money. And so there's not any direct studies related to epigenetics and money. There's just a lot of correlated kind of conclusions that have been made, including mine. But what I find to be really interesting is we look at the atrocities of the Holocaust. Can we look at the atrocities of slavery and Jim Crow through that same lens? And in looking at the atrocities of slavery and Jim Crow through that same lens, there is certainly a protracted period of time that Black Americans have experienced trauma on multiple levels, physically, emotionally, spiritually, you name it. And that trauma has compounded over time because it's never been addressed. It's never even been acknowledged. And so when we have conversations, or rather when conversations are being had in today's age around how long ago slavery was abolished, and how there's nobody alive today who had slaves and nobody alive today who was slaves, we're missing that invisible link that connects the individuals present today to the individuals present, multiple generations ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And I go further in my expression or articulation of this idea around epigenetics to include really the kind of origin of epigenetic studies in talking about not only how we pass on that trauma from generation to generation through our DNA by way of maybe a shorter tolerance or resistance to the stress hormone cortisol, but also in the food that we eat. And so I draw parallels between what has been, called soul food, and the connection that we see in Black men and women around heart disease, obesity, diabetes, etc., and this kind of running narrative that these diseases exist within our families, which is kind of half true, right? The diseases exist within the food that we eat, that we pass down generationally, but our sensitivity to those diseases also exists, if we look at it through an epigenetic lens, as a result of this compounded trauma that we have. And so the relationship between stress, trauma, and food, particularly as we look at, again, how the brain functions and the dopamine and some of those cultural bonds, when we are mourning, we eat. When we are celebrating, we eat. Everything in between. And sometimes the act of eating is compounded by consuming alcohol, compounded by consuming tobacco, compounded by consuming large amounts of sugar. It creates this large kind of, it's almost like if you escape this unscathed, like you're lucky, because there's so many risk factors present that would point to some form of disease because of this intergenerational transfer that speaks to our gene expression physically by way of the environmental factors, like I said, what we eat, what we drink, what we smoke, if we smoke, what we, whatever, and also from a trauma perspective, specifically as it relates to the stress hormone, cortisol, and maybe other expressions of trauma in our DNA. And so put simply, epigenetic studies have kind of surfaced this idea that not only is the trauma that the individual experiencing in their lifetime going to be present and ultimately may have an impact on the expression of genes in their lifetime, but they can be impacted from the trauma and or stress from people previous to them, so their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and also they may be contributing to future generations' gene expression, even if those future generations don't experience the same financial stress or struggle or strain. They may be reacting to the trauma that you experienced or that your parents experienced or that your grandparents experienced. And I think that that's a super important piece of the puzzle to incorporate in the text, because again, we talk about financial trauma through the lens of what is it that I experienced directly, and or what is it that I observed about people's experiences with money, right? The have versus the have-nots. Are we treating, people who are homeless or people who are poor poorly? And also, when I had socialized this conversation, many people respond in this way of, well, I never experienced financial hardship. Like, I don't have any financial trauma. I can't have any financial trauma. I've always had money. And we don't realize that, maybe the reason why you have money is because of the trauma and stress that previous generations had endured to put you in the position that you are in today.
Without telling the book, I would rather people read through the book themselves to see how they respond to their traumas, their money scripts, their money narratives, as you mentioned in the book. But could you give us a high-level overview of your framework of the 3 E's that you use to overcome financial trauma?
Yeah, so the 3 E's, it's funny, was developed before I had the language to describe financial trauma. And I'm just like, oh, this makes sense. Like, I'm going to fit this right here. But the 3 E's stand for exposure, education, and execution. The 3 E's in particular, and I'm not sure if I included this in the book or not, I think I did, was born out of the process of my purchasing a home. So I mentioned so much about what are the drivers for that for me. The exposure piece was realizing that it was possible for me to buy a home, right? So what is this concept of home ownership? Seeing, peers within 5 years of my age own homes, and reading the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, and okay, this is the process, right? This is what I have to do. Okay, I need to become aware of my credit. I need to improve my credit. I need to have a down payment, understanding, what is this idea of home ownership and what does that mean for me? So that was exposure. Education was, of course, getting educated on the process, learning of the ins and outs of, who I need to have involved, what is it I need to have prepared, what does it take for me to get qualified, all those things. And then execution is actually doing it, right? Pulling the trigger. And I was in between the education and the execution phase in this home ownership process, or the pursuit of home ownership, rather. I've been looking for a house for maybe 1.5 years at the time, and I was getting really frustrated with the process because A, there were 2 houses that I had put offers in that had fallen apart, and I'm like, this is not going to work. But B, there was... I think there was this rush in my mind. I wanted to buy a house by the time I turned 25, and I had turned 26 already. And I'm like, is this ever going to happen? But we started moving forward in the process. I had gotten pre-qualified. I submitted my paperwork. I submitted my my bank statements, all the things, right? And then I started to get cold feet. And I started wondering, can I afford this? And not just from a perspective of, can I afford this right now? But this is taking all the money that I have right now. What happens if 6 months down the line, I need to replace the roof, or I need to buy a new furnace, or I need to, do XYZ thing? I don't have anybody that I can call in my family and ask for $5,000, $10,000, $15,000. how am I going to be able to bail myself out of the situation? And I almost allowed these thoughts of what if to talk me out of the purchasing process. And so the execution phase is the most important, because I just paused because I was thinking, like, do I want to stake my flag here? But I think the execution phase is the most important, because that's where a lot of people get stuck. There are a lot of people who are very knowledgeable about the process to accomplish something financially. But when it comes to the application, they get stuck. And what helped me get across the finish line in that instance was this idea of community, right? I had people around me who were like, hey, we understand your concerns, and you may not have immediate family that you can call on that can bail you out, but we won't let you fail. And it was that reassurance that allowed for me to move through the process with confidence. And, the funny kind of irony of that concern was everything that I was worried about happening ended up happening at some point, right? I needed to replace the roof. I needed to replace a water heater. I needed to replace a furnace, right? And I didn't realize at the time of purchasing that, homeowners insurance was a thing, and that I could submit claims, and that, a lot of these things would be covered out of the insurance pocket, and, I would have to pay the deductible. But I just imagined what life would look like for me today if I allowed those thoughts of what if to stop me from moving forward in the home buying process. And so I took that framework of moving through those emotions and that process and applied it to this idea of overcoming financial trauma, because not only is it just something that I thought up, but it was something that I worked through. And so I fill in the gaps in this book, and through the work that I do, really what I talk about, what I socialize, how I communicate with clients, with those as kind of pillars in that experience. But of course, adding in many of the evidence-based practices that show up in financial therapy, that show up in financial counseling, that show up in financial planning. And helping people to visualize, recognize their safety first off, right? I'm safe in this moment, but visualize what a plan for the future looks like, and then walk through the steps of accomplishing that. Some people are capable of doing that on their own. Some people are capable of going back to the communities that they come from and using that as kind of an anchor. And some people need hand-holding. And I think that there's a charge on all of us as financial professionals to be that person, to hold the individual's hand when they are kind of experiencing that shaky foundation, particularly if there's somebody like me who doesn't come from a community of people who have resources to support them in their undertaking. Because what I found on the other side of those 3 E's is that I've been able to then pull people forward based off of the act of overcoming, right? So I could trace, I want to say 6 home purchases through the experience of overcoming that fear, right, of that trauma, and purchasing a home myself, by then being for the other people what this group of people were for me, and that's community.
That's powerful. We've buried the lead somewhat. You obviously have put, a lot of heart and soul, blood, sweat, and tears into writing and documenting your journey of overcoming financial trauma. And shortly before the release of this book, you experienced a brand new trauma. Can you share that trauma and how it impacted your relationship with the book that you just wrote?
Yeah. I think it's funny now. It wasn't funny then. But the irony of the experience is that, I started writing Overcoming Financial Trauma in January of 25. I had a deadline for April 31st. It went for editing. It came back. I ended up writing, some more. And so I finished, I think, the book in its entirety probably around June. And so going through the process of production, right? the editing, final editing, typesetting, all those things, and ultimately leading up to pre-sale period. So literally 30 days before the book was set to release, I had a house fire. And I spent a lot of time today talking about the significance of buying that home. It was a multifamily, and what that meant for me symbolically, in terms of the overcoming, if you will, of my, seeing that eviction notice on the door as 14, 15-year-old Rakim. I think when people found out about this news, they were like, oh my God, like the structure, right? The building itself, his home. And yes, that was certainly traumatic. That was, one of the 6 sources of financial trauma, right? That was the financial hardship. I do not have a place to live. But I think deeper than that, and to your point, or the question around, what did that do for the relationship that I had with the book? It was also symbolic. I realized at that time, or very shortly afterwards, that that book meant something to me. I mean, sorry, not the book. The house meant something to me, in terms of how I wrapped up my ideas of what financial success looks like, how that defined me in terms of my financial success, and how that made me feel I don't want to say invincible, but how that made me feel certainly insulated from like this false sense of security. And so when I see all of that, literally, because I saw the house burn, I was in the house while it was burning. So I'm standing on the deck of the house and I'm watching the flames engulf the second floor and the roof, and the windows are shattering and the siding is melting. I'm watching the house burn in front of me. I was just like, no way, right? Like, I think anybody would feel that way, no way. But in relation to the book, for the next 30 days, I not only was homeless, homeless not in the sense that I'm sleeping on a street corner, but homeless in the sense that I don't have a home, I'm living in a hotel. But also, like, I have to embody the lessons that I just put my name on in this text. And so the book became a lot more intimate for me in terms of, being the thought leader, the expert. Like, all of those things don't matter when you are watching your house burn down. But in the process of rebuilding, which is a process that I'm actively engaged in, to this moment, I've had to really take the lessons that I've included in the book and recognize, okay, what is my nervous system doing in response to this? How am I perceiving a threat in this moment? What does that look like in terms of my financial behaviors and or other behaviors? Why do I feel triggered when I see a candle, right? Or, any kind of open flame? How do I work through that? Is it okay for me to spend this money, right? Because, part of my community, part of the healing power of community was realized through this. A friend of mine had set up a GoFundMe, and so many people rallied behind it. And so contributing funds to the GoFundMe, is it okay for me to spend this money? What can I spend this money on? Are there any restrictions on how I could spend this money? And then, of course, my insurance kicked in and I got an advance on some of the property that I've lost. And so, the most money that I had been like deposited into my account, and this feeling of wanting to hold on to it because my body and my mind haven't fully relaxed in recognizing, okay, you're safe now, right? I'm thinking still, what if something else happens? And so I think I shared a post recently on LinkedIn where I talk about how I'm noticing in myself themes of this kind of like oscillating vigilance and scarcity, which makes sense because I just had a traumatic experience. But, the surgeon doesn't perform surgery on themselves, right? And so even though I can recognize these experiences from a psychological perspective, from a physiological perspective, right, in terms of my nervous system, from a financial perspective in terms of like, how am I navigating my finances? Oh, and by the way, I'm an entrepreneur, and so I need to still find ways to make money. But oh, my computer burnt up, and you know what I'm saying? Like, oh, like all my books burnt up, and oh, I have to go out and give a keynote, and I have to go out and go to this conference, and there were so many things that were happening in that time period of the 30 days between the fire and the book release. And then, of course, the book comes out. Funny enough, the day that the book was released, I had just arrived to Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, to participate in AFCPE's conference, and I was keynoting. I was closing keynote for that conference. And so I'm just sitting there like, what's going on, right? Like, is there a plan for this, right? But I think an experience like that would make anybody spiritual, because, again, the timing, right? 30 days before, then 30 days later, this is it. And then now I'm on stage and I'm having to deliver this message to, I think the expected attendance was 400 people, and not lose it on stage, right? But I had books present with me at the conference, and certainly being able to tell this story helped move those units, right? So I sold out at the conference for sure. But the book continues to have significance for me because I put so much into it without knowing that I was going to have the fire. And so I think it's created let's say a greater appetite for not only awareness around the fact that this is a topic that needs to be discussed, but also empathy and people wanting to support me buying the book. And as a result, if they decide to crack open the book, maybe they are recognizing within themselves like, oh wait, like this is something that maybe I should pay attention to. And so, I'm just trying to keep the momentum alive with talking about the book and talking about my experience in tandem, because there's a difference between being a subject matter expert, sitting behind a desk and talking about the topic, and actively living the topic that you're talking about. And so part of my strategy and efforts with this year as a part of the healing process is to engage in a practice of what I'm referring to as healing out loud. So talking about what does that healing look like as we move through this new execution phase. What does execution look like? And being very vulnerable and very honest about where I am, particularly as it relates to my finances, how I'm managing the situation. I haven't openly discussed yet like what navigating the insurance claims process is, partially because I don't know what the legalities of that look like, and there are still things that are falling into place, and I don't want to jeopardize that. But certainly I think people are often underinformed about what engaging with their insurance company looks like, particularly in an instance of a loss that is tied to fire. There are multiple complexities that you have to navigate simultaneously. And, I've been fortunate to be surrounded with some professionals who can kind of take things off my plate. But I can only imagine if I was navigating this experience by myself in the midst of experiencing, this trauma and the overwhelm that comes with it. Because there are people who chase fires, right? And that was one of the first things that I was warned of. It's like, hey, there are going to be people knocking down your door, figuratively, trying to get you to work with them and overwhelming. I can tell you this, in hindsight now, I'm sitting in front of the house after being inside the house while it was burning, trying to save my dog. The dog is saved. I have soot all around my mouth, all around my nose. There was ash in my throat. The emergency medical services was on site, and they're like, hey, you gotta go to the hospital. Like, we have to take you in the ambulance right now. And I'm like, no, I'm good. And they're like, no, you're not good. Like, this can escalate very quickly. You could die. And so my mom comes, and I hand my dog off to my mom, But as I'm laying in the stretcher, there's this man who's on the site who's shoving a piece of paper in my face, like, "Hey, I'm here to board your property up and make sure that nobody accesses it while you're not around. I need you to sign this." And there's so much confusion around me at the time. I can imagine that if this person was malicious and they had hidden some language in this document that granted them access to, who knows what, that I wouldn't have had the bandwidth to pick up on, I would have just signed it away. And so, that happens. That's a part of the process. But so this happened October 18th. We are, several months removed from that situation. I have since calmed my nervous system, or in the active practice of calming my nervous system. I have engaged in intentional play, building Legos, playing Xbox, building puzzles, like doing things that allow for me to relax. Certainly keeping my discipline with going to the gym, because as I've shared in the book, this experience of trauma is a somatic one as well. And so we have to exercise that trauma out of our body. I've gotten massages, so many things to make sure that my body is right. But also, there's things that I'm still very avoidant to. There's bills that I haven't even looked at. They're just piling up. And I know, from a financial professional lens, these are things that you need to address, but from somebody who's in the middle of experiencing that moment, just hey, those things will be there. I'll get to it when I get to it. And so it's been an interesting balancing act to be kind to myself while also adhering to the norms and structures of what I feel like I should be doing. And people ask me "Oh, why are you doing?" I'm like, the best that I can, given the circumstances.
Well, man, whenever circumstances like that come up, be it a trauma, be it a death, the one thing I avoid is telling people stuff like, you gotta be strong, you gotta so I'll just say, man, hey, I don't know the experience, but whatever it takes to get through it, I pray that you receive it and have access to it. So this has been a very powerful reading, but I told you before that we won't let you get out of here without addressing some of the comments you make in your own book.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so we're gonna do some quick hitters. This is something that we actually did with Brad Klontz. We had Seth Godin on the podcast. We did the same thing with him. So I'm gonna take 3 of what I feel are the most powerful quotes in the book, and I'm just gonna say, hey, where's your head at when you wrote this? So let's see. There is no generational wealth without generational buy-in, and there is no generational buy-in without generational healing. What does that mean?
Yes. Great quote. So, being in the financial education space and as a financial professional, I have seen a lot of marketing from financial professionals and other, sellers of products and services using that phrase generational wealth as their dog whistle to get people to commit. Period. Right? I had a thought. I'm not gonna go down that path. In using that language, though, you are pressing on a pain point for people, right? Who doesn't want to be the quote-unquote black sheep of the family and change the trajectory of what wealth building looks like for their family? It sounds great, but in the process, you take this vulnerability and you're taking advantage of it. And so I made that quote to illustrate, first of all, that point is true, right? We're using this as a sales language and on an experience pain point that is very real. And secondly, that, people have opted into this illusion of, I am going to build generational wealth when, we're also opting into this individualist approach to money that is characteristic of capitalism. And so I really wanted to drive the idea that generational wealth building is communal. And that, yes, you may accumulate physical wealth, and you may create the structures for what that wealth looks like through trust and what have you, and your estate plans, and how you direct that. I think a lot of the big analogy that people like to use, or a metaphor, is what the Rockefeller family has done, or what the Rothschild family have done, and they're trying to duplicate those processes. But if the next generation is not bought into the same set of values, not bought into the same rules or the same culture that you believe that you are facilitating, then you'll lose your generational wealth in the next generation or two. And so really placing that emphasis on what community building looks like. And I think in that section I also talk about this idea of culture, and how we define culture and how we surface culture and share that with other people. It does not have to just be something that is static, that exists because this is where you were born, this is the language you speak, this is the religion that you practice, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you get to be a part of actively molding what that culture looks like and offering that up to, first off, the people that exist within, your lifetime, but also like creating more insulated structure for how you pass that on to future generations.
I hear that. Man, I'll say this. If you are listening to this podcast and it doesn't make you want to buy the book, which we're going to put on screen again, Overcoming Financial Trauma, I really don't know how to help you. if that's the case. To me, it is, we have authors on this podcast, and it is rare that we have them on because I don't have them on unless I truly identify with the content in the book. So I appreciate you for your time. I appreciate you for your message, and I appreciate you for being a guest on the New Money, New Problems podcast. Before you leave, tell people, we're going to put it in the show notes, but tell people where they can find more of your work.
Yeah, RahkimSabree.com, that's my website, so it's just my name. But my work is everywhere, right? So I have a column with Forbes, the Forbes.com /sites/Rahkim Sabree. I have a newsletter on Substack, RahkimSabree.substack.com. And then all of my social media is my name as well, at Rahkim Sabree, no hyphens, underscores, or periods, because there's a lot of fakes out there. So at Rahkim Sabree. And I interact with people, right? Like, so don't be afraid to reach out if you have a comment, question, something that resonated, something that you would like to learn more about. And then certainly, last but not least, Overcoming Financial Trauma is available everywhere books are sold. But I do have a page on my website, so you can go to overcomingfinancialtrauma.com, and there's links to Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Bookshop, and Amazon. If you're interested in grabbing a copy, and if you already have a copy, I would love and appreciate your review on Amazon or Goodreads.
For sure. And if you're finding them for the first time and you're an 80s or 90s baby, it's Rakim, Rahkim. Do not spell it like a rapper.
Thank you.
Rakim, we appreciate you for your time, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you.
Let's get some money.
From New Money, New Problems, this was the New Money, New Problems podcast, a show for successful professionals searching for the tools they need to navigate financial opportunities and obstacles they've never seen.